This is a video that I've been wanting to make so badly for the past month or so, not only because it's a pretty significant update on my own lifting journey, but also because I think the things I'll be sharing in this video will be quite interesting and valuable to hear for a lot of people who might be in the same bucket as I was when it comes to lifting. It's almost a direct follow-up to the video I made some months ago where I went over how and why I had lost motivation towards lifting and how I tried getting it back. The reasons I gave at the time as for why I was demotivated were quite serious in the sense that it was a combination of various different problems all happening at the same time. However, despite all that, I never relied on motivation to begin with, meaning that I never stopped working out and I was still training very hard despite kind of hating it, because I knew that the effort that I'm putting in right now will be worth it months and years from now, and as a slight spoiler, I can definitely say that it certainly very much was. However, training for long periods of time out of sheer discipline and zero motivation can lead to less optimal outcomes, which is why I decided to start trying even harder than I already was and challenge myself to a really difficult workout program in the hopes that the increased results and fortified habits will eventually bring back some enjoyment and motivation that I had lost towards lifting. And so, after 6 weeks of training almost every single day, I successfully finished the program with the statement that my motivation towards lifting had returned, at least for the most part. This quote-unquote for the most part essentially meant that while some of the demotivating factors that I had been dealing with, such as recovery problems and sleep deprivation, had subsided, the other aspects were still there, and deep inside I was still not that enthusiastic towards lifting anymore. And the reason why was because I no longer had anything to look forward to. As I said at the beginning of that video, I had lost interest towards increasing my strength numbers as I felt like the effort and opportunity cost of increasing those numbers was way too high, especially considering that when I actually hit rather big milestones, I kind of felt nothing, and on top of that, I knew that every milestone from here on is only going to get harder and harder to reach. Yet, despite all that, I still kept on lifting, so after finishing 531 building the monolith that I did in the video, I eventually came up with a new goal for which I decided to start a squat specialization program. I did that for around 4 weeks until I decided that I'm more interested in just returning back to the program that I always do, aka 531 Boring But Big, which is a very popular program, and its incredible simplicity has also made it kind of legendary. Unfortunately though, I was only able to do it for around a few weeks until I got really sick, so I barely ate any calories and skipped the gym for around 10 days, which once again meant that I had lost a lot of strength and had to restart the program. Around the same time, a new gym had also opened up nearby that I wanted to check out, and it also presented me with the opportunity to optionally take a break from the big 3 barbell compound movements and try experimenting with machines and dumbbells, which was something that I've kind of been wanting to do for a while now, so I started a program that didn't include any of the big 3 lifts. I actually had done the program once before, but back then I modified it to include all the big 3 movements because my home gym didn't have access to the required equipment, such as the hack squat machine, and at the time I also felt like it's better if I continue doing those lifts anyway. And I was actually quite enjoying the program in its mostly original form. At one point, I also decided to look up if anyone else had any thoughts on this program, and I came across a video by this channel called Natural Hypertrophy. The video commented on a few interesting topics that I hadn't really delved too deep into, such as minimalist training and why it can be problematic. Upon going a bit deeper into the rabbit hole, I also discovered this channel called Basement Bodybuilding, and I really want to share a few highlights from a specific video of his that really resonated with me.
Alright, what's up everybody? So today's video, this is going to be about minimalism and how it's going to fail you when you're trying to train for hypertrophy. I kind of founded this channel on the idea of minimalism in powerlifting strength type training for hypertrophy is going to fail you, and it's a terrible place to go down. I have a video that I want to play, so I'm going to stop the video and show you my physique from back when I was doing this style of training. You take a look at this physique, and it's a good physique. The physique isn't the problem, and I'll touch on that a little bit later, but the problem is the method that I used to get to that physique, and it was a minimalist method. And The issue with it is how much time and energy I had to put into that given method just to get that physique. I don't say just, actually. I'm not trying to downplay how I look because I know it's a good physique. But here's the problem. Look at the arms. Look at the forearms. They are absolute twigs for the numbers that I was hitting, the numbers that I was required to hit to get to that physique. So the numbers, you guys will be shocked. This guy was deadlifting over 600 pounds. Like, does that look like someone, you'd think that by the time you get to a 600 plus deadlift, your physique would just be totally jacked. It's just these unrealistic strength standards that you finally hit after so much time, only to realize they don't work. And now what? Do I need to deadlift 800 pounds? Like, at what point does this stuff end? And it gets better too. It gets better. I was benching 225 for 20 reps. 225 for 20. And in no way is this me trying to brag about my strength, but you're hearing this advice now while you're not already wasting your time getting there. That stupid minimalist mindset where I would just go in, do a squat, bench, deadlift, and then do like accessory work, whatever that means in bodybuilding, with no effort, no intensity. And to expand on this point, this is where the problem of minimalism really comes into play. A lift like the deadlift, it's like, oh, it hits your back, your lats, your forearms, glutes, your entire posterior chain. It's like, okay, at what point is this going to end? At what point are we just going to admit that deadlifts don't work your forearms? Just because a lift hits a muscle doesn't mean it actually grows that muscle. Those are two completely different things.
Alright, so the first thing you probably noticed is that this video is coming from the perspective of hypertrophy training, aka training for aesthetics, also known as bodybuilding. The gym video I made, however, was entirely focused on strength, and even more specifically, strength on the big three lifts, aka the squat, the bench and the deadlift, and I never mentioned anything about aesthetics or hypertrophy, so why am I showing this video at all when I seem to be entirely strength or powerlifting oriented? Well, I wanna show a response that I left to a comment on my previous gym video. Essentially, the comment asks for what discipline I'm training for, whether it be bodybuilding, powerlifting, or something else, and my response was that I was mostly in between with no very strong focus towards one or the other. This response may seem a bit ironic considering that my previous video left the impression that I seemingly care much more about strength than anything else, so if I do care about hypertrophy as well, why was I seemingly so focused on just chasing strength numbers? Well, one of the reasons why is of course that despite all its ups and downs, I actually am passionate about strength on the big three. It's essentially a hobby to me as it's kind of a skill in of itself that you can improve at, which gamifies lifting and can make it more interesting and easier to stay consistent with. And while training for strength isn't always the easiest nor the most enjoyable thing in the world, I am also aware that such periods of low motivation that I experienced in that video are also often caused by external factors that will eventually subside. However, there is another, quite potent reason for why I was so focused on strength as well, which is the fact that I was under the impression that chasing strength numbers and primarily focusing on increasing the peak for compound lifts was not only the best way to go about strength training, but hypertrophy as well. And there is a really specific reason for why I was under this impression. I started consistently working out in 2016, and what got me to stay consistent was first and foremost health, because I knew that working out is healthy, so I should probably be doing it. The reason I chose resistance training though was because I found it more enjoyable than the alternatives, and I also liked the fact that as a kind of a free side effect, I'd also be able to build my body and get stronger. And so, after having done calisthenics for a while, at one point I started going to the gym, and in order to learn about what I should actually do there, and to overall familiarize myself with gym culture, I primarily consulted sites such as YouTube and Reddit. The thing is, however, that on those websites, especially on Reddit, there is an extremely strong emphasis on the big four compound lifts, as well as increasing strength on those specific lifts, so it didn't take long before I started incorporating them myself as well. At first, I was kind of just winging it by running my own random made-up program, but as I learned more, I eventually decided that it's probably better to start doing a real program made by somebody who actually knew what they were doing, and the one I chose was the widely recommended 531 by Jim Wendler, which is the same program that I mentioned that I've been doing on and off for years earlier in the video. 531 is primarily a strength training program, however, there wasn't really much else of a choice in the sense that, as I indicated before, the quote-unquote more educated lifting spaces were all strength and powerlifting focused, so pretty much all the recommended programs were fundamentally powerlifting programs. And this essentially meant that no matter what your goals were, be it hypertrophy or strength, the consensus will dictate that the training will be the same regardless, aka a barbell compound movement focused program containing training the squat, deadlift, bench press, and most likely the overhead press, with the objective to add more and more weight to the bar over time. This in turn caused the attitude towards other exercises, primarily isolation work, to be seen as merely quote-unquote assistance to the primary lifts, which also gave the impression that said exercises are inferior or just plain unnecessary, even when it came to training the muscles that said isolation work would target. For example, there is an article by Jim Wendler, the author of 531, which describes assistance work for one of the templates as follows. It's important, but I wouldn't keep track of it. None of this should be anything that really matters. It should be effort-free. And then there are two paragraphs which essentially seem to solidify the idea that assistance work, especially isolations, are something that you really shouldn't pay that much attention to or put much effort into, and if you do, it would give the impression that you were inexperienced and naive compared to the lifter who is stronger than you, yet barely even tries when it comes to bicep curls. Attitudes like this further fed into the consensus that chasing strength on the big tree is just truly the answer to everything. Even when it came to hypertrophy, people often recommended programs such as 531 Boring But Big, wherein the big indicated hypertrophy and the boring indicated the fact that it was a template that was extremely high in volume when it came to the big four barbell movements. However, it only included 2 unique exercises per day, which means that at least in terms of exercise selection, it was obviously an extremely minimal program. It was minimal to the extent that the template indeed didn't include any bicep isolation work, but it did include chin-ups, which, especially the weighted ones, are a relatively taxing compound movement that include multiple muscle groups at once. Yet, chin-ups are one of the most recommended bicep exercises, at least in these specific spheres, so it's no wonder if you fall under the impression that that's all you need if you want to grow your biceps, or any other muscle group that you'll from now on end up avoiding isolating because it doesn't seem to be necessary. Which makes it only natural that even if your original goal was hypertrophy or aesthetics and bodybuilding, you'll eventually just end up becoming a strength athlete for the simple reason that everything seems to be pointing towards that style of training being a tried and true method towards whatever goals you might have. And this is also the impression that I was under, which in turn allowed me to not have strongly defined goals, because no matter what those goals might have been, the outcome and training would have stayed the same. And now we have come full circle, which brings me back to the video from Basement Bodybuilding that I shared earlier. The reason I played a whole 2 minutes of it was because it directly contradicted many of the things that I just explained, and it pretty much solidified my suspicion that the path I was going down was only going to lead to more and more disappointment in the long term. And the more I learned about hypertrophy training for natural lifters, the more I realized how incredibly important proper programming is when it comes to making progress at more advanced stages, and just how fundamentally lacking most of these previously mentioned quote-unquote hypertrophy programs were. Many of the strength training /powerlifting programs are inherently minimalistic because indeed, if your goal is just strength on the big 3 or 4, it makes sense that you wouldn't waste your time and energy doing things that aren't directly correlated with said goal. However, many of the widely recommended quote-unquote hypertrophy programs by the same authors are also programmed in a similar minimalistic way, which makes it highly probable that after years of running those programs, you're most likely not only going to end up with underdeveloped muscle groups that will take years of work to catch up, but there is also a high chance that the results that you'll eventually get won't be worth the amount of time and effort that was required to attain them due to the potential ineffectiveness of these programs. Aside from the minimalism, the primary reason for why these programs can be ineffective is because even though they are intended as hypertrophy programs, they still have a first and foremost strength training mindset. This means that your main priority is still going to be chasing strength numbers, which is counterproductive because it means that you're most likely going to be progressively overloading only by adding more weight to the bar until it eventually just becomes too heavy and you hit a plateau and are essentially forced to deload, regress, and start over with a lower weight, which becomes a cycle and only slows you down when it comes to accumulating hypertrophy. However, with a proper hypertrophy training mindset, instead of chasing strength numbers, you chase stimulus, which makes strength just another tool that can be utilized to accumulate higher quality stimulus. A lot of people think that the main difference between powerlifting and hypertrophy style training is that for powerlifting, you use heavier weight and to lower reps, and for hypertrophy, you use lighter weight and to higher reps, but that's actually not the case. Hypertrophy training can still include heavy strength work such as 3x3 deadlifts and so on, but the overall programming, mindset and reasoning behind them is completely different. First of all, powerlifting training is often composed of periodization in the form of specific training blocks of, for example, high volume phases, deloads, peaking and so on, with the goal of increasing your 1 rep max as much as possible on specific lifts, which you then repeat in a cyclical manner. In hypertrophy training, however, the goal is to accumulate as much stimulus as possible over the long term, which makes hypertrophy training a lot more consistent and linear, because specific phases such as peaking are not necessary, and thanks to having a higher flexibility when it comes to training, you can program in a way that lets you avoid having to take deloads, and actually, programming in such a way is kind of a necessity, because having to constantly deload is just XP waste when it comes to hypertrophy. And this mindset is the real difference between hypertrophy and powerlifting style training. If you didn't know, powerlifting is a competitive sport with very specific rules that you have to conform to and prepare for. The winner is the one who has the highest combined total in the squat, bench and deadlift, which means that aside from just baseline strength, there is also a lot of skill involved in these specific lifts, so you always need to be neurologically adapted and primed for them, which means that the mindset and programming are obviously going to prioritize very different things compared to hypertrophy training. When it comes to hypertrophy training, however, unlike in powerlifting where performance is objectively measured based on a specific quantifiable metric, it's more of an art form than a sport, because whatever goals you might have are entirely subjective, meaning that it's not inherently competitive. This also means that there is a lot more flexibility when it comes to your training. However, that flexibility comes from the fact that there is a wide variety of subjective goals that you can have, which also requires your programming to be specialized towards those goals. This ultimately also puts a lot of personal responsibility directly on you to make sure that your programming is specific and optimized to your own subjective goals. For example, if you follow a hypertrophy program like Boring But Big in its vanilla form, the end result of what you might get might not even be what you want. Which means that once you slowly start entering the more advanced stages of lifting, regardless of discipline, whether it be powerlifting or hypertrophy training, you're going to need to have strongly defined, meaningful goals, because the amount of willpower and discipline that's going to be required to make significant progress from here on is not going to be viable if you don't have a direct goal that you can fully dedicate yourself to. For strength training, the end goal is most likely going to be something rather straightforward yet meaningful, such as becoming the strongest version of yourself, but for natural bodybuilding, however, it can be a bit more complicated in the sense that you need to find a subjective internal motivator from within that only applies to you, such as a goal physique that's unique to yourself and only you care about. Of course, where the meaning in lifting lies within the grand scheme of things is something for you yourself to figure out, but there is this one quote that I still remember that reads as follows: "It is a shame for a man to grow old without seeing the beauty and strength of which his body is capable." And regardless of who was the actual author of this quote, I agree with it in the sense that I personally lean very heavily towards considering the mind and the body as inherently connected, as if they were two sides of the same coin, in which case building your body and discovering what it's also capable of is a dimension that cannot be experienced in any other way other than lifting, as there is no replacement or alternative to this activity. And ironically, if you manage to create an objective that was born internally from yourself and for yourself, striving towards it will not only be fulfilling, but will eventually lead to a more free version of yourself that has more strength and confidence to also help, inspire, and uplift others, because you went through what it took to uplift yourself. This is also why, if you do find that objective, don't try to get there by taking the shortcut that will ultimately lead to your own destruction by internally locking you away from the benefits that you would have received, not at the destination, but on the journey that you were supposed to take to get there. Anyway, as for how all of this applies to myself, recently, I've been more motivated than ever when it comes to the gym, not because I've stopped powerlifting. In fact, I've been running a deadlift/squat specialization program for around 10 weeks straight now, but instead because I actually have a lot to look forward to now. The reason I'm running the specialization program is essentially just for fun. I still have a very specific powerlifting goal that I'd like to hit before the end of 2024, but my long-term goal, which to be honest I didn't even have before, doesn't really have anything to do with powerlifting numbers. I'm instead much more interested in natural bodybuilding, not in terms of quote-unquote sport, but just within my own bubble. meaning that I only do it for myself, not because of external influences or for validation. For me, it's kind of like character customization in a single-player game. You just make a character that you personally like, regardless of what anyone thinks about it, because you're creating your own adventure and fantasy, not someone else's. And this is the type of adventure that actually inspires and fulfills me much more than just chasing numbers. Of course, I enjoy that as well, but it feels like, at least for myself, it should be more of a side quest rather than the main story. Having a goal physique to strive towards gives me a lot of direction and motivation in terms of what my training should look like for years to come. And since the physique is rather unique, I pretty much have no choice but to eventually make my own program, which also gives me a lot of incentive to start learning about proper programming when it comes to natural hypertrophy training. I'm also excited to see the fruits of the seeds that I lie today, in the sense that now that I've finally taken a less minimalistic approach to training, I'm focusing a lot more on the muscle groups that I actually care about, yet had neglected, such as the forearms and biceps, which should be able to make significant gains over the next 2 to 3 years. Other than that, I also care a lot about upper legs, primarily glutes, but I also actually have muscle groups which I feel like are already very developed to the extent that I'm not even sure if I want them to get much bigger anymore, which means that my training should also reflect all of those variables, and once I'm done with the powerlifting programs that I'm doing right now, I'm excited to slowly start building a program that does exactly that. When it comes to the training itself though, there is quite a big difference between powerlifting and proper hypertrophy style training, and while both are extremely difficult, the overwhelming performance-focused aspect of powerlifting/strength training often leads to judging your workouts based on the performance that you had in said workout. It's kind of like League of Legends in the sense that you don't always win, and it can sometimes make your day worse. However, since hypertrophy training focuses on accumulation, it's more like a cumulative grind, meaning that as long as you do your best and control all the controllable variables, there essentially are no bad gym days, because even if your performance, aka strength, wasn't on par, what mattered was that you actually got the work done and added additional XP into the bucket. And even when natural training can occasionally make you feel like that what you add into the bucket are merely just drops, the same applies for learning a language, how to draw, or essentially anything worthwhile, as it's all cumulative and improvements will be inevitable as long as sufficient effort and discipline are consistently maintained through years and decades. And just because you are stuck in gold or platinum doesn't mean that you hit some kind of a natural limit, nor that everyone above you is cheating. The difference between you and a challenger player in all aspects is so large that you don't even realize how vast of a difference it is, which luckily also means that both the cause and the solution always lie within yourself.